I realize that a lot of our economic system, has a lot of flaws, that a lot of problems with it, like wage labor that's not particularly pleasant, that, the rich have, there's a big gap between like rich and poor. But, I mean, it's together now because there's been like increasing standards of living in America, and isn't that in one way like a justification for it, the why it's still around, why capitalism, from my understanding, has triumphed and it's still strong?
No, it's not. I don't think so. I mean, there was rising standards of living in slave societies. Slaves were much better off in the early 19th century than in the early 18th century. Is that an argument for slavery?
Well,
it's a terrible argument, I mean, any system, in fact, you could give that argument for Stalinism. There was very substantial economic growth in the Soviet Union. It's the second world, not the third. It was, until 1989, it was the second world, not the third world. Now it's back in the third world because it's undergoing capitalist reforms. Something you're not allowed to say, incidentally, but if you read, you'll notice. They've had 10 years of capitalist reforms which have driven them right back into the third world where they came from, okay? But if you just look at it in terms of economic growth, it was reasonably successful. That's exactly what bothered Western leaders. If you read the documentary record, right up to the 1960s, where it sort of runs dry at the moment, you find that the great concern was that the Soviet Union was presenting itself as a model for modernization within a single generation. And that was raising all sorts of trouble, not only in the third world, but even in the rich countries. They didn't care about Russian aggression. What they cared about, or Stalin's terror or anything, it didn't bother anybody. Actually, the same is true of Cuba. The documents have just been released, and they're interesting, on Kennedy and the Kennedy administration in Cuba. And it's kind of interesting to see the way the facts are being hidden. The documents that came out not long ago from the early 60s bear directly on this question. Arthur Schlesinger was the head of the Latin American mission of the incoming Kennedy administration, which was laying out, talking about the problems and the plans for Cuba. And there he explains what troublemaking in the hemisphere means and what the Soviet connection means. He said, the problem with Castro, he said, is I'm quoting, the spread of the Castro idea of taking matters into your own hands. Okay, which he said has great appeal to people in Latin America, most of whom live in terrific poverty and oppression and are trying to find a more decent life. And with the model of Cuba in front of them, they're likely to do all sorts of things. So that's Castro's troublemaking in the hemisphere. Or take, say, fascism. I mean, why was Hitler so popular? Hitler was the most, through the 30s, Hitler was the most popular leader probably in German history. Well, the reason is he carried out a social revolution. People were living a lot better. I mean, like not everybody, not Jews, for example, but Germans were living a lot better. It was very successful. Hitler either understood or, figured out, or his advisors did, that large-scale state expenditures could rescue a morbid capital economy from destruction, pretty much what American business learned during the Second World War. And he was doing it. And it was, the economy was booming, people were better off, and so on. Is that an argument for fascism?